Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early warning briefing for Friday, the 11th of October, 2024. I am your host, Mike Shelby. We're going to start off here. Listen, next year, we are going to hear a lot about Mexico. You may be Mexicoed out next year. A couple of big things are happening. Number one, after January, our new president's going to be inaugurated. That person is going to have to deal with Mexico. Also, the USMCA is up for review. And there is some concern that, the Mexican position is weakened under their new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and also that Mexico's, I think the Mexican government has been kind of counting on the United States nearshoring a lot of its production, and as opposed to reshoring, and Trump wants to reshore. Trump does not want a lot of business going to Mexico. He wants a lot of business and a lot of new manufacturing coming to the United States. And that is going to pose major problems for Mexico. For more, we're going to bring on Jared. Jared, there's a very important, I think, panel discussion that happened earlier this week where some former ambassadors to the United States from Mexico and U.S. ambassadors to Mexico discussed the economic reality of Mexico's economy and really kind of weakness here. What's going on?
Yes. So just to lay out the actors here, we've got Mexican ambassadors to the United States, Arturo Sarukhan and Martha, I believe you said it was Bárcena?
Bárcena, yep.
Bárcena, thank you. And then U.S. ambassadors to Mexico, Roberta Jacobson and Tony Wayne. Sarukhan and Martha, Bárcena says that the Mexican government is betting on the U.S. pursuing a nearshoring policy, but that the U.S. is likely to pursue a reshoring policy instead. She specifically was citing the U.S. presidential debate in this.
Mm-hmm. Let's just break that down. So nearshoring would be U.S. leaders saying, all right, we want to bring back all of our critical manufacturing production back to the Western Hemisphere throughout Latin America, where it's closer than China. And that's what Mexico's been counting on actually since 2021 and definitely into 2022. That's been one of the big drivers of growth throughout Mexico and Latin America is this reshoring of manufacturing that's happening in China now, bringing it back to the Western Hemisphere. But as you just said, Trump wants to reshore, not nearshore. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No worries. Sarukhan pointed out that Mexico's biggest nearshoring competitor is actually Texas, since the worry that is reshoring. He also added that Mexico is facing a similar energy shortages as we do here in the U.S., which just prevents manufacturing infrastructure being built entirely because they don't have the power to make these things or run them.
Yeah, just briefly, part of Sheinbaum's campaign pledges earlier this year was to work towards reindustrializing parts of northern Mexico. And she wanted to build these new factories to make stuff that the United States is going to import, because it makes sense just to make that stuff right up near the border, and you've got this really short logistical problem to solve. And she's running into the same problems, which there's not enough electricity in Mexico to run these big factories.
Bárcena also believes that the U.S. Congress will seek to renegotiate the terms of the U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement upon its review in 2025, which is just next year. And she says this is a very large problem because the Sheinbaum administration has no trade experts ready for renegotiation, and all former experts are neoliberals.
Mm-hmm. And just briefly, that was one of the big things under AMLO, is this rejection of neoliberal officials, neoliberal thought in Mexico. He has this thing, or had this thing called the fourth transformation of Mexico. AMLO was a left-wing populist as opposed to the neoliberals who have previously been running Mexico. Also, Sheinbaum, she's a technocrat. She's also somewhat of a left-wing populist, a little less so than AMLO. But the removal of all these experts from AMLO and now from Sheinbaum is really going to come back to hurt Mexico when they've got to renegotiate this USMCA thing.
The U.S. ambassadors to Mexico also weighed in. they advised Mexico against further pursuing what they called a triangulation policy, which is basically playing China and the U.S. off of each other. And they said specifically, hey, this is just going to anger the United States because there are very few things the U.S. Congress agrees on, and China is one of them. So you need to stop. The ambassadors from Mexico to the U.S. they're pretty vociferously agreed about that.
Mm-hmm. That's an important point because earlier this year, maybe last year, there was a big question: is Mexico going to become a member of BRICS? And I think AMLO kind of flirted with that, but ultimately he said we're not going to join BRICS. Why? Because earlier this year, Mexico became the United States' top trade partner. They're economically dependent on the United States for a lot of things. Another one of those things is Mexico is dependent on U.S. oil exports to fuel its economy. Sheinbaum had pledged to green the Mexican economy. Remember, she's a technocrat. She has a PhD in science, and I think it's actually in environmental engineering or some kind of engineering. She's a PhD, technocrat, expert class. That's who is in control of Mexico right now. And those plans to green the Mexican economy are going to stall. She's coming up against really some economic realities here. As I mentioned, she also promised to reindustrialize parts of northern Mexico. That is also not going to happen. And I think really the most dangerous scenario here is that Claudia Sheinbaum, number one, like AMLO, she does not want Mexico to be seen as a vassal of the United States. Under AMLO, we saw a lot of things. AMLO was kicking out the DEA out of Mexico, really limiting what the United States was allowed to do in terms of going after cartels, going after gangs, going after drugs in Mexico. He did not want Mexico. He did not want the United States to interfere in Mexican politics. We also saw some efforts by AMLO to do a couple of things. He was trying to nationalize some industries. He was trying to make these constitutional amendments. Really, he wanted to remake the judiciary and turn Mexico into a one-party state, which he has successfully done. Morena is the most dominant political party there. They have control of Congress. They have control of the Mexican presidency. They have control of a large majority of Mexican states as well. Morena, that's the left wing, really kind of a socialist political party down there. At any rate, if you look at what Latin American countries have been doing under left-wing leaders, especially Lula da Silva in Brazil, they have been pivoting towards BRICS. And so I see this as a potentially worst-case scenario here. Just again, Sheinbaum does not want Mexico to be seen as a vassal of the United States. Closer relations with China is one alternative. If she can't get what she wants from the United States, maybe this is something that China will provide. And so, as we've seen again with Brazil, most dangerous scenario here is this pivot towards China and towards BRICS. All right, we will move on here and we'll invite Robert on. Robert in post-Hurricane Milton, Florida. Hey, Robert, can you give us just a quick sit rep here of the situation there in Central Florida?
Yeah, right now where I'm at, most of the flooding is receded. There's some damage here and there, to businesses. And most people, seem to be recovering fine. As far as I understand, over in Tampa and on the West Coast, it's a lot worse. So we got pretty lucky that it got downgraded to, or it weakened to a Category 1 as it came over the state.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. We're going to start off here inside the Beltway, and let's just, if you can hang on for 2 seconds, let's just go ahead and cover this thing. Speaking of China, the Biden administration under the U.S. Treasury, they're getting ready to announce a plan that would offer alternative financing options for countries currently under the heel of China's debt trap diplomacy. This is where China comes into a country and they say, well, we're going to help you revolutionize your economy, and you're making stuff that's great. You've got to be able to export them. And so if you'll take these massive loans, we're going to come in, we'll build your roads, we'll build your railways, we'll expand your ports so that you can export all this stuff. And the problem is these loans are too large to ever be paid off by these countries. And so what this allows China to do is when that country defaults on these loans, China can just come in and say, well, we own your ports now, we own your mines, we own all this stuff that we help you build. And it is really economic colonization. And so The U.S. Treasury has this new thing they're getting ready to announce called the Pathway for Sustainable Growth. They're going to be working with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, also private creditors to make loans to these countries. And so this is another geostrategic plank here the United States is pursuing against China. All right, with that, let's go ahead and jump into the Beltway roll-up, starting with FEMA. What's going on, Robert?
Well, FEMA's administrator, Deanne Criswell, said they've already spent almost half of the appropriations for the entire fiscal 2025 year that they were given in this recent continuing resolution. They said they're going to start reserving money for life-saving operations, which means there's going to be far less money for rebuilding until Congress returns in November. And then moving over to the Federal Election Commission, they also took a vote where they were deadlocked on imposing restrictions on joint fundraising ads. And this is going to give Senate Republicans a major advantage in campaign fundraising, especially in some of these these races that have become tighter in Republicans' favor over the last couple of weeks, including Wisconsin with Tammy Baldwin's seat, in Ted Cruz, where it's moved slightly towards Democrat calling all red. This will give him a fundraising boost as well. So it looks like Republicans are on track to take a majority in the Senate still. And then over to Maine in the First Circuit. First Circuit Court judges suggested during oral arguments earlier this week that a Maine law that bars foreign governments and companies with partial foreign ownership from spending on state elections violates the First Amendment. There's also another case in the Sixth Circuit similar to this with an Ohio law called Section 121, where the court upheld their law, but the dissenting opinion said that it could run into issues with the First Amendment. So I think this is important because now we're starting to see arguments in the courts on foreign financing for state elections and ballot initiatives, and that seems to be becoming another of one of these First Amendment fights, where one side is going to argue for First Amendment restrictions to prevent foreign election interference. At the same time that at the national level, we're seeing talks of First Amendment restrictions to prevent basically domestic political dissent. And then the EPA announced that this was the rule about replacing lead pipes. It was announced earlier this week. A consultancy firm called Arcadis US, their planning director, Rebecca Slabaugh, said that the $17 billion that's set aside to help cities do this across the entire country by 2037 is not enough to replace the lead pipes. And this is similar to the PFAS rule we talked about earlier this year, where it's really going to hit a lot of these cities that have very marginal budgets, some of them deficits, and they're going to be required by law to start replacing all of this water infrastructure, and it's going to lead to probably a lot of canceled projects or delayed projects and some budget shortfalls, I think. And then moving to national level, this is something I've been talking about with the Harris campaign and their pivot to the center with immigration. There are a lot of these pro-immigration groups that seem to believe that Harris's pivot is temporary, and after the election, they're going to start this ramp up for implementing pro-immigration policies. This is coming from the Refugees International and also America's Voice, and they're saying that there's a chance that once we're past the election, she's going to change her tone and change her focus from the current Biden administration focus on the asylum restrictions. So I expect after the election, like we said before, we're going to see a lot more of these parole programs and ways to basically get around any kind of congressional requirement on changing immigration laws. And then finally, moving over to Indiana at the state level, their Attorney General, Todd Rokita, he released a memo saying that their Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission needs to look into these early retirements for coal power plants because he said they are, quote, duty bound to prevent these retirements until they can be replaced with dispatchable power sources. And this was a request from State Senator Chris Garten, because he said Indiana lawmakers are actually considering changes to the law after they started hearing warnings of power shortages from their grid operators. This is something I expect to see in more states as we get closer to 2025, 2026, is more states going back on these coal power plant retirements and 100% clean energy mandates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hate to harp on this, but this is just baffling. There's a guy who's a former Goldman Sachs hedge fund, and I asked him about hedge fund manager. He had this. He's one of the guys that's been talking about how great AI and how great AI is, and the marginal cost of power is going to zero, and we're just going to be living in this like techno green utopia as solar scales with AI power demand, and I mean, he laughed. I asked him about power shortages, and he laughed. And I don't understand how people are not seeing this. There are grid operators. There are people at the state level now warning about power shortages, warning about lowered grid resiliency, and I don't understand how they're not getting this. Robert, is there any reason? I mean, is there any reason why we will not have power shortages starting as soon as next year? Because you look at the numbers, it's very, very concerning.
I think it would have to do like what we're seeing in Indiana, and I think we've also reported on other states where they're talking about going back on these clean energy mandates. I think even New York has said that. Kathy Hochul has said that they're going to delay some of these clean energy mandates. I think that's what would delay those power shortages, because some of them have very stringent ones. New York had one; they were the first one to have a 100% clean energy mandate at the state level. And they're now going back because they're also seeing a lot of these clean energy projects that were supposed to replace, fossil fuel power generators getting canceled. I think the last time I looked, almost half of the green energy projects slated to replace the power plants were canceled because of money issues. So that's the move that could delay or prevent a power shortages going back on these early fossil fuel power plant retirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly seems if some of those regulations are not rolled back, I agree. I think that is the only thing that's going to prevent this. All right, and then I'm not sure if Jared's internet dropped. I'm not sure if he's able to come on or not, but I'll just go ahead and hit this. One of the things also, Robert, we've been talking about is this Biden pivot towards nuclear. The Biden administration has now approved restarting 2 of these nuclear power plants. By the way, they are less than 1 gigawatt apiece. That's something like 700 or 800 megawatts. And so one of the big things we've seen with this is an increased need for uranium. And apparently the Biden administration continues to approve these carve-outs for on Russian sanctions to allow U.S. energy firms to import uranium. And this is coming directly from the DOE here. All right. Robert, thanks for that. Do you have anything you'd like to add on that topic, Robert?
Yeah, I think this nuclear pivot is going to be hindered by this because Russian uranium, its highest, say, low enriched uranium nuclear fuel is 25% of the fuel in U.S. nuclear reactors currently. And then this restriction that was signed in May but actually took effect last month, I think unless they continue to sign these and probably sign more as these projects come online, or future Harris administration potentially, it's going to really hinder that nuclear pivot. And like you said, these are relatively low, power sources when we're talking potentially 300 gigawatts needed across the entire country. So if they're going to do this nuclear pivot, they need a lot more, and that's going to be hit by these fuel restrictions.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. We're going to try to get Jared back on here. He has this very, very interesting item. And at first I started reading through this and I said, Jared, where are you going with this here? All right, there's I guess it's called the World Send Congress, and they're holding their annual conference in the UK's House of Commons. It is being moderated by a British parliamentarian for the first time. It's coming up this weekend. And this conference is specifically calling on the United States and United Kingdom governments to ensure the rights of Baluchi, Sindhi, Kashmiri, and Pashtun peoples in Pakistan. And you say, why does this matter? Well, the big thing here is you look at, we've talked about this for several years now, the China-Pakistan economic corridor. China is trying to build out an energy and logistical lifeline to circumvent oil imports through the Strait of Malacca. China fears if they get into a period of crisis or conflict, the Straits of Malacca get blocked maybe by the United States or some Indo-Pacific allied navy, and 80% of China's oil imports are now gone. They are depleted. They're no more. And so China says, well, we got to build this China-Pakistan economic corridor so we can start importing stuff from these Pakistani ports. And this matters. This matters greatly, this World Send Conference, because you look at these 4 groups in Pakistan, the Baluchis, and by the way, we've also talked about this for a couple of years, the importance of the Baluchi Liberation Front, which they have been conducting terrorist attacks against Chinese nationals in Pakistan, killing engineers and petroleum engineers and construction workers and all these Chinese firms that are building nuclear. I think they're building a nuclear power plant in Pakistan. They're building road and port infrastructure. And so you look at the Baluchis, the Sindhis, the Kashmiris, and especially some of the Pashtuns here, some of the Pashtun independence movements. If those four groups do win independence or do start some major conflict inside Pakistan, it would potentially cut off CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and that would close a logistical and energy lifeline to China. And so it's very important that this World Sindhi Conference is happening in the UK because the United Kingdom is part of NATO, and therefore they're also very concerned. I'm not sure if it was the UK, but it was definitely NATO in their latest doctrinal update. They called China essentially a threat now, not just an adversary, but an active threat. And so it would be strategically advantageous for the United States and the United Kingdom to ignite that fire. This is not a prediction. I'm not saying they will, but just looking at why the World Sindh Conference is happening in the UK right now. This also is a primary concern for India's security. And so it may be in India's it may be in Indian interests for this to happen as well. Moving on to Israel, they have not decided on how to respond to Iran's ballistic missile attack. There was a meeting last night, and there was still some split. By the way, we've seen this multiple times now. Israel's security cabinet failing to agree on a course of action. And realistically, we're looking, I would say it's less likely that Israel attacks nuclear infrastructure in Iran. The Biden administration has been weighing heavily on Israel to not destroy Iranian oil infrastructure. If Israel wants to crater the Iranian economy, they do it through oil. And then finally, we're looking at potential assassination here of senior Iranian officials. Again, if you're Israel, you have to do something to stop these from the Israelis' perspective. You want to deter future Iranian attacks. All right, moving on to the ASEAN summit here. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is trying to rally the ASEAN countries against China and to finish a code of conduct for the South China Sea. Marcos cited a Chinese attack on Vietnamese fishermen alongside the slew of confrontations with the Philippines. This has been ongoing we've been covering it for the better part of a year, maybe two now. Chinese Premier Li Qiang denied China had done anything wrong, and he also told ASEAN countries to respect and support China's peace efforts in the South China Sea. Moving on here to South Korea, their defense minister is telling the South Korean parliament that North Korea is highly likely to deploy troops to the Ukraine war, and that he believes a Ukrainian report that several North Korean officers were killed and wounded near Donetsk. And then wrapping up here with BRICS Plus, there's a finance ministers meeting, and the Russian finance minister said, quote, BRICS economies in general show greater stability, pursuing responsible economic and financial policies. He also encouraged BRICS members to reject the IMF and the World Bank as they are, quote, not working in the interests of the BRICS countries. By the way, the BRICS was, I think it was called the BRICS Bank, and I think it's called the New Development Bank now. That is one of the central efforts spearheaded predominantly by China to counter the IMF and the World Bank. China is trying to build these competing international institutions and siphon away leverage that the West currently has through all these international institutions. And with that, we do have some questions here. Oh, by the way, and just briefly, Mexico's finance minister met with the CEOs of JP Morgan and BlackRock. That's Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink. We don't know the details, but I look at that, and that's almost certainly trying to get financing from Mexico. Here's a problem. Mexico may be facing a bankruptcy, legitimately. They may need a bailout because they have these massive social programs. And I think it's Mexico's social programs rely on 5% GDP growth for Mexico per year. And I think they're currently sub 1%, if I recall those details correctly. So Mexico is maybe getting a lifeline here from JP Morgan Chase and BlackRock. By the way, I said it was less than 1%. Mexico's GDP growth is for 2024's forecast is 1.5%. Right, and that's at least forecast, and it probably also depends on who you ask. We do have some other questions. There's a lot of, and this question is about the period between the election in November and then the inauguration in January. If people feel the election outcome does not reflect the will of the people, what does your crystal ball reveal as the range of reactions we may see? Do you see this as a tipping point, rivaling that of mass amnesty? This is a problem that we are working on. Robert and I worked on essentially like a decision tree or an event tree, and looked at the range of possible scenarios. And they really boil down to Trump wins or Trump loses, and Harris wins or loses. I think this election will possibly be decided by the Supreme Court. I don't think it's so much a matter of if Trump wins or if Harris wins. It is how they win, and if it is decided by the courts. If a Trump victory is decided by the Supreme Court, that the left already sees as illegitimate, it's going to be very, very difficult for me to say that it will not surpass that of 2020. The potential for riots, but definitely the potential for disruption. A lot of this hinges on whether those plans that were formulated between 2016 and 2020 are put in place. If you recall, back during the 2020 campaign, there were a bunch of groups. Shut Down DC was one of the primary groups, and they held this Zoom meeting, and they spoke about this stuff publicly, and none of them were, I don't believe any of them were arrested for potentially terroristic threats. But they were talking about shutting down the economy if Trump won, and they said they were going to foment a general strike. They were going to stay home from work. They're going to block critical infrastructure like ports and commercial hubs. I've talked about this frequently. There was that pamphlet that was distributed back, I think in 2019 or 2020, called Chokepoints in a Fragile Economy, or Chokepoints in a Fragile Network. And in that pamphlet, they looked at economic choke points, and they said basically how easy it would be to cause an economic disaster if Trump had stayed in office, either legitimately or illegitimately, had he stayed in office in 2020. And so looking ahead to 2025, those plans haven't gone anywhere. If anything, those plans have only become more refined. Now, there is a big gap between what you're able to plan for and what you're able to mobilize and put into action. But remember, all this left-wing stuff is a dial, and I think it's very easy to dial, especially with the media. The media is a prime agitator. And remember, too, the media made a killing. I mean, they made massive amounts of money during the Trump administration. Another period of chaos would be economically advantageous for the media. So they do have a vested interest. They are incentivized to create this again. And so really the question is, how far is this dial going to be turned up? And one potential course of action is that dial does get turned back up to a 10. And what we saw in 2020 will potentially pale in comparison. So this is a problem we're still looking at, and as we get closer to the election, we'll publish what we think. Right, in your opinion, why do you think Biden told Netanyahu not to strike Iran's oil fields and nuclear silos? Well, let's just focus on oil. That would be very bad for the global economy. That would be very bad for chances for Harris's election chances as well. That would be an October surprise at this point, I think. You get a massive price in oil spikes. Oil spikes, I think, have preceded every single recession since going back to like the 1970s or something like that. When you get a doubling in the price of oil, historically that leads to recession. I think that's probably the biggest reason why Biden does not want Israel to go after Iran's oil. I mean, we're talking about a scenario here where the Strait of Hormuz gets shut down, causes another massive problem for supply chains. All these trade contracts that are, priced in on relatively low price oil, they're going to be in disintermediation. And so I think that's just a big problem that Biden doesn't want to deal with. The Harris campaign definitely does not want this. And I think that would be advantageous for Trump. All right. Last question here is, how can we sign up for the pre-election intelligence workup? Is this recorded for catch up? What is the cost? So yes, I did put out, I think it was earlier this week on Monday or Tuesday, I did put out, I'm doing a 4-week training series called the pre-election intelligence workup. And we're building an intelligence system. If the election does go, if is doing some heavy lifting there. If this election does go sideways and we do see riots, at a minimum, we'll see protests, maybe riots, maybe political violence, maybe something worse. And this is not going to be over anytime soon. If Trump wins, this will not be over in a matter of days or weeks. And so what we're doing is we're building an automated intelligence system. So you can plug in your local, whatever local political or social groups you have, your local political and government leaders, your local places. We plug all that stuff into an automated open source intelligence platform. And you can sit back and monitor this stuff. If you're trying to maintain situational awareness, you know, we don't have 20 different browsers up reloading stuff all the time, and we're not having to go out and search information. We're putting it onto an automation or aggregation platform, and that information is coming to us. We just have to build the feeds. So that's what we're doing. I did run when I launched that, I did run a greatly reduced price for everyone. Let me think about what we'll do, and if you're interested, email me and we can work with you. We did have a timeline on that for the special pricing. And yes, all those sessions, there's 4 sessions, and they're all being recorded. All right. Also, Robert, thanks for the reminder. We will not be here on Monday. It is Columbus Day, and the team will have the day off, but we will be back in your inbox on Tuesday. Again, just shoot me an email or ping me through Early Warning Network if you're interested in that pre-election intelligence workup. If you want to build your own intelligence system locally, maintain situational awareness, especially if you're in a high-risk area or if you have family members in a high-risk area, this is something you need to be paying attention to. And here's the thing, even if this election goes off without a hitch and it's not contested and the other side just says, well, we lost, we're going to give up and go home and try again in 4 years, building this intelligence system, we can apply this to earthquakes, hurricanes, any kind of disasters that happen, as long as the internet's still up. All right, everyone, have a great long weekend. We will be back in your inbox on Tuesday, back on the show, starting at 08 Central Time on Tuesday. Until then, be well and stay out front.